guys, I got an F150 here today that has lean codes to it, and I've narrowed it down to the intake manifold. So we're going to go ahead and R&R the intake manifold, and I'm going to walk you through it, how to do it. These are very common for lean codes on cold starts, and they also have coolant leaks by the thermostat housing over there also. The first thing we want to do is drain the engine coolant so that can drain while we're taking off other pieces of the engine here. And the drain cock for it is on the passenger side here. Just unscrew it a couple turns like that, and then it'll drain out into your drain pan for a while. The next thing you're going to want to do is spray down this EGR tube, this big nut right here, with rust penetrant, and let that start soaking while we're doing other disconnections also. Pull the intake air temp sensor, put the connector to the side, band clamp, and then we got the air bypass tubes here, and vents for the PCV system. Pull those off, and they can just stay there. Undo the clamp on the throttle body. It's an 8mm. Take this whole thing as an assembly off. And there's a wire right here for the mass airflow sensor. Comes down under this and connects in. Disconnect that. And then we can take this off as an assembly. Pull your purge line for the intake here. And then just put that to the side, out of our way. We can start disconnecting the TPS sensor and the EGR VR connector. Unclip your throttle cables from the bracket right here. Just use a cat claw. It's a little push pin, and that'll just loosen them from that. Like that. Alright, we got you in here a little closer. There is 3 bolts here, 1, 2, 3, that support the power steering reservoir. Take those off and we'll get that bracket out of the way. They're 8mm. That's the bracket I'm talking about. I can go up there. There's 2 10mm bolts that hold this bracket to the intake manifold. They're right here and right here. Get those out of there. Pull your throttle return spring off. Put it to the side. And then this one, which is for the speed control, you just push this that way, and it'll unclip. Just like that. And this one, you just unloop it from the cam here. Alright, now we're getting somewhere. Pull the upper radiator hose off so we can get that out of the way when you start pulling the alternator and all that. Get this harness out of the way. And then pull the 2 10mm bolts for the thermostat housing. Wow, this has got to be original. 160,000. At this point, if you haven't changed the thermostat before, it's a good time to change it since it's out right now. Let's pull this heater hose off so we can get that out of the way. Off to the side. And now we're going to pull the alternator off and get that out of here. It's got 3 3 10mm bolts behind it. There's a little bracket. It's a little bracket like that. There's 3 bolts. There's one that fell behind here. I'll get it in a second. Release your belt tension with a breaker bar. It's a 1/2 inch. If you got a 1/2 inch ratchet, you can do that too. It's just easier with a breaker bar. This alternator has 2 ears down below. They're 2 10mm bolts. These little ears I'm talking about, there's 2 of them. I get a lot of questions on how to keep all the bolts together in the right areas and all that stuff for reassembly, especially when you're taking off so many like this. And what I do is something like this. This is for the alternator. We just took it off. There's 3 bolts for it. Keep them with the bracket. 2 bottom ears on the alternator. Have these bolts on it. Take them all, put them piled all together. Makes it a lot simpler. Hasn't failed me yet. Alright, so just plop that alternator to the side there on top of the battery, or you can take it off. I just cover the battery and it'll hold it just fine out of the way. Alright, it's time to get this vacuum tree off of here. There's a big port on the side of the throttle body adapter here, on the side here, and that's where they get fed from. So pull that out first, the big one like that. You can come over and start getting it loose. It connects on the EGR VR right here. Take the bit to get them off. And then of course your EGR valve. And then it goes over here. To your fuel pressure regulator. There's another one on there. And then it keeps going. You can see it right here. Over to the purge valve. I suggest use a cat claw, something like this, when you take them off, because they will tear. So if you kind of hook underneath them and push up instead of pulling, they'll come out and get this whole tree out. Alright, let's get these big old tubes out of the way. They're just in our way right now, and they're coming off anyways. Take your cat claw and you go back here where it connects to the bypass. And you kind of help it off. Just follow it around, you'll see what I'm talking about. Off as an assembly. And this one just goes down to the driver's side valve cover. And pretty much, if you help these off by going between there and prying up and pulling, these softer hoses like this, they won't tear or break. And we can get them off without ruining them, as long as you're helped by pushing and pulling. DPFE connector, take that off, put it to the side, and then same thing with these DPFE hoses, and you'll see them. We'll push them down. You don't want to get too wild, because these little plastic ports on here will break off. Now you can get some more of these brackets off in here. There's a 10 mil right here that goes into the intake, and there's one on this side. It's a nut, this is the bolt. Once those are off, and pull this whole thing out of the way. Okay, this nut right here is 1.25 inches, and I like to use a open end wrench like this, so we have the length and the leverage. Put it on there, and then we do the hammer effect. This one's actually pretty loose. That's good though. We don't want them to be frozen up. Should turn it by hand. Okay, now we're getting in here nice and deep. Back here behind this throttle body adapter, there's one more big vacuum line, and that goes over and feeds the booster. Right there, it's a 10mm bolt. Undo that, put it to the side, and then we're going to disconnect it from the adapter here and take this whole line and take it off from the booster too, and we're going to put that to the side, and it just pulls out the booster. Once that line is off, we can pull the 4 8mm bolts out of the throttle adapter here. There's one here, back there you can see, there's one here, and there's one there, and then this whole thing will come out as an assembly. Alright, all 4 bolts are out. This one will hit, so one just stays in, and we can pick it up as an assembly and start coming out with it, and then we can disconnect the IAC valve right there, and it all comes out. Make sure you change this gasket out. This will cause the same problems with leaking and causing lean codes also. Make sure that you stuff that intake with rags or paper towels. I like to use rags. This one takes 2 of them, so I put 2 of them together, and then I stuffed them in a looping fashion, up and over, and then they stick out like this, and this way you can never forget a rag down the intake. While we're in here, get that PCV tube off of the intake. Start working it off of there. And then we take the whole tube itself and the PCV out of here. Next thing we got to do is get the coils and injectors unplugged, and then we're going to move the harness back a little bit and get them all out of the way, because we're going to have to pull the ignition coils to pull the intake. Start getting all this stuff cleared out of here. Now that we got that mess of a harness out of the way, we can start pulling these coils out. There's 7mm bolts. Get all 8 of those out so that we can work on the fuel lines next. Before we go ahead and release pressure and then pull these 2 lines off, these fuel lines right here, you can see they're packed with mud and stuff, and you can see how nasty the rest of this is. So we're going to do a good cleaning with the blowgun before we go any further. So let's release the pressure in the fuel system, if there is any, before we start pulling off those lines over there. Just got to press the little pintle on the Schrader valve. Some rags on it to capture it. This one only had a little bit of pressure in it. It's been sitting. Now you can come over to these. There's little retainer clips on them. They go like this. Just pull those off to the side. Now comes the releasing of the lines. This one's a 5/8 release tool, and this one is a 1/2 inch. And you just push it in, and it'll release that garter spring on there, and then you can pull a line off. There's going to be 8 bolts in the actual intake. They're 10 millimeter, and then there's one over here on the crossover, and that one's also all 10 millimeters, the same size and length and style bolt also. Take all those out. Then we are pretty much free to pull this intake up and out of here. As an assembly. You're going to be leaking some fuel, so tilt it this way. So go ahead and get your gloves on and get dirty and start cleaning all this out. And then we're going to do a final cleaning with brake clean. Make sure you cover your ports in the head there, so that we get no debris down in there the best we can. Protect them. And then we're going to clean the intake also on the bottom side. That'd be a lot easier than this. And then we can start reassembly. Alright, I got the whole intake sealing area on the heads cleaned up. New gaskets on. Wiped them down with brake clean. Make sure that you clean out these bolt holes. There's going to be a lot of debris in them, so we can get a good clamp load and we're not bottoming out on garbage in there. And then make sure your spark plug wells are cleaned out too, blown out. And then I do a final blowout of the cylinder head ports here too. Now on this one I'm putting a new thermostat and O-ring. Either way you should change the O-ring, but I'm putting a new thermostat in because it's definitely old and garbage. Make sure you clean the sealing area where the hose goes on here, and then where the housing presses onto that O-ring to seal it. Make sure you get that all clean. And all debris off of there. Try to lay it down straight as possible so we're not grinding against the gaskets. After that we can start taking our bolts and putting them in here so that we can align the intake up perfectly. Starting by hand, the front two. And that'll help ease in the rear ones you can't see for alignment. Once all these bolts are back in, we need to snug them down. Just snug them down by hand, really lightly. The actual spec is 18 inch-pounds. And that's just to seat the intake down, and then we could do the actual torquing up to 216 inch-pounds. Make sure that your thermostat and your O-ring for it is all back in here. And then we're going to put the housing back on because this is actually part of the torque sequence. So we're going to get it all lined back up on there and snug down too. And then we'll do a final torque of the intake. Now that our thermostat's back on, we got all the bolts snugged down so we can start the major torquing sequence. I'll put a link to the picture of the sequence down below. One note on that sequence, there's an error in the book, and it goes from 10 and then it goes to 13, and this one right here is 13. There's only 11 bolts, and this one is number 11. Now we can go ahead and start torquing it down in sequence. Before going any further, I put the fuel lines back on. I put a little bit of oil in the O-rings. Help them ease back on. Let me get those on there. Just make sure that they're fully clipped and that you can't pop them off. You see how you can't see the garter spring all the way? And now you can. That's how you know they're fully on. That garter spring will be visible all the way around. Make sure they're all the way on, and then put their retainers back on right away too. The safety retainers. Now's a good time to get those wiring connectors back on all the injectors and coils. And make sure your coil boots are clean and not full of oil. If they are, you can get replacement boots by themselves without buying the whole coil. And if they are soaked in oil, it's coming from your valve cover gasket. So you should probably change that, because it will eventually lead to misfires. Put a little dab of dielectric grease in there. Before we throw his throttle body intake adapter back on, we need to do the connections behind the intake, which is this PCV tube. We can go ahead and get that on there and fully seated, like so. There we go. And then we can connect it in over here at the valve cover. Now it's starting to look like an engine again, with all the coils back in and all the connections. Got the throttle intake adapter back on. These bolts, there is no torque sequence, just do a cross torque, and it's 89 inch-pounds at first, and then it's another 90 degrees. And then we could go over here and get this nut started before we got anything else in our way. I put a little bit of anti-seize on there, and you should be able to thread it by hand, no problem. And then we can just snug it up by hand with that 1.25" wrench, and that'll be more than enough to seal it up. Time for this vacuum tree. It goes just like this. Lay it all in here. Now we put our DPFV and EGR-VR bracket back on. One nut, one bolt. It'll go back on. Do your nut first. That'll align it. I'm gonna put the screw back. We can finish our vacuum connections to it. Your DPFV connector, connect that in, and do your two hoses. One is fatter than the other. You'll see them. You'll see the difference quite easy. Just match it up with the ports on there. These vacuum lines in, and we can TPS sensor, EGR-VR. Let's get this brake booster hose back on so that we can have full access to it, make it a little easier. Just route the hose through, connect to the intake on this side, and then we can get a bolt. It's a shorty 10 mil. That way that's all lined up, and then we can just plug it into the booster and then tighten this bolt down after that. Now we can put this air bypass tube on. It goes just like this to the IAC. Just pushes on. And now it'll sit there like that. PCV vent valve, put that on. Goes into the valve cover. Push it down all the way, and then it just sits here with these two. Now we've got to put our vacuum line on for our purge valve over there. That just connects right here. Just pushes on like that. Now we're getting her done. We got 3 8mm bolts. our support bracket. And then we can come around to the bracket that holds all the throttle cables. Two 10 millimeters. Your throttle cable goes in like this. It goes in that little slot right there. And you feed the wire through. And then it lays down on that cam. And then it should rest just like that. And then this one for your speed control goes in like that. It hooks onto there like that. And then you push it this way and it should clip in. In the end, it should look something like that. It's pretty simple. You'll see when you get to it. Make sure that the retainer that goes in this bracket, that little hole right there, get that in there. Get your heater hose back on there. Push all the way down. And then try to line up these marks on here with your clamp so that it goes in the same spot. One last thing on the throttle, make sure you hook in your return spring to the bracket and then over to here on the eyelet, just like so. And then try it. Should return by itself like that. Alright, it's time to bolt that alternator back on. I got the 2 bolts down below, started by hand, not tightened down yet. And then we're going to do the 3 bolts for the bracket in the back here by hand. Now we can tighten the lower bolts. And then we can get to these top ones. They'll be fully aligned now. Time to put that belt back on. Make sure we got all the ribs lined up and all the other pulleys. Make pulling the belt tight while we got our breaker bar in here. And we'll just feed it over the alternator. And that'll finish it. Now we got to put the radiator hose back on. Make sure you clean out the inside of the hose where it seats in there. Get a good leak-free connection. And push it on all the way before we even start messing with that clamp. Line your marks up on the clamp so that it fits in that same area that's been compressed already all these years. We won't have no leak issues then. Air intake snorkel back on. Do your intake air temp sensor before you forget. There we go. You got your mass airflow connector, and you connect back in over here under the air box. That goes there. Get these hose connections on here. Okay. Get your air box halves aligned, and then we can we'll have the proper alignment for this. Push it out all the way and tighten it. Put your negative battery cable back on and tighten down your drain valve there if you haven't already. One last check. Make sure it's filled higher than it should be, because it will suck it down. And then keep washing this once you start the vehicle. Keep it topped off until it bleeds out.